crisis begins, and in this case, it's only about the average temperature, but there are so many other dimensions as we'll see. But the crisis begins and has accelerated with the Industrial Revolution, and we should never forget that the Industrial Revolution came along, was a kind of involved a strengthening of capitalism, and it was basically funded by colonialism in many important ways. Think critically and transformatively about building sustainably in India. So I'll be devoting a little bit of time in the beginning on how do we think of sustainability, and especially in the context of building. Then we will go on to a number of examples of how practitioners of sustainable architecture in India have built over the last 30-40 years, or maybe more actually, and a couple of slides on the lessons and implications that these practices and what I discussed before in the first part of the presentation, what it implies for just building in general, and also how we should be thinking of inhabiting the buildings. What this talk is not about, it's not about building science, in the sense it's not about the physics of say heat transfer, or even how the physics of how buildings behave in relation to heat or even ventilation. And though we will be looking at particular strategies that different practitioners have adopted and explored, and which have worked in many cases very well in most cases, this is not a talk which shares technical advice of the how to build sustainably. So it's more about how to think about building sustainably, because I feel very strongly that we have a tendency in our overall public discourse to clutch at solutions as if they are always ready-made. And one of the things that hopefully will come through clearly is that there are no ready-made solutions. There are possibilities, and there are good practices that have worked so far, but they all have to be configured anew in a particular case and problem with a critical perspective. So let me start by saying, much to everyone's dismay perhaps, but it's not so bad, that there's no such thing as sustainable architecture. Because when we say sustainable architecture, it means that, yeah, some architecture, there would be some way of building which will be completely sustainable, right? But what we are talking about, and what we certainly can aim as an ideal for, is to start from zero, which means we aim to have as little impact of any kind, negative kind, as possible through our building. So when we say sustainable architecture, we are talking of either more sustainable or less sustainable. And this is a very important thing to bear in mind. So let's begin with some perspective on sustainability itself and the crisis of sustainability. And this is very brief, but it's very important to remember that how this crisis of sustainability has been created. How has it come to be that our planet, or our lives, human race and many others, many species, are at risk? Suddenly, how does it happen? For thousands of years, there's been no problem. So it's the graph on the right is just one of many such you will find online, which show that really the crisis begins, and in this case, it's only about the average temperature, but there are so many other dimensions as we'll see. But the crisis begins and has accelerated with the Industrial Revolution, and we should never forget that the Industrial Revolution came along, was a kind of involved a strengthening of capitalism, and it was basically funded by colonialism in many important ways. Okay? It's also not something that is of purely European origin. Societies, not just us in India, have tended to equate a combination of industrial capitalism or even industrial, socialism, perhaps, and the consumer economy increasingly as being the same as modernity. So our imagination of modernity is of cities full of cars, of wide roads, which is something we have just consumed as images and experiences from the West. And it is, I would argue that that is an uh, uh, important thing to be critical towards when we even start talking about the solutions to some of these crises. Then in the 20th century, what has happened is this idea that free market capitalism, or the freeness of markets, so-called, which is never really entirely the case, even in the West, the ideal of endless growth and of endless consumption, okay, as almost a moral ideal, and in extreme cases, a moral compulsion in the US very often. This has really taken hold, and this helps us, each of us individually, but also as a society, as government policy, um, justify and take it as a good thing that I should change my car every 3 years, my phone every year, and so on and so forth. It's good for the GDP and so on and so forth. It's good for me, of course, in terms of the luxury that I am used to. And there is a mainstream belief that you know there are you can't have an omelette without breaking some eggs. So there's going to be some environmental and social damage if we need to have growth, because economic growth is sacrosanct. We've come to believe that, even if it's actually destroying our planet. We have the evidence for it. And there's also the other side of the coin of this belief is the belief that technology will overcome all the problems that have been created, ironically, by technology and by 200 years of capitalism itself. So this is the background. This is the way I see the sustainability crisis, and it will become evident how it matters in thinking about building. Now, what is building as usual? Because when I say sustainable architecture, I assume that there is something which is not sustainable, or which is, let's call it building as usual, what you would do without thinking very much. So there's one image which is a sort of extreme image on the right, which is, and there are many other kinds of buildings. You just look around in whichever city you are in, and everything you see is likely to be building as usual. And in this, at the design level, buildings are designed in a way that I would call, to be polite, socially and environmentally innocent. They're simply unaware of the impact that building construction has on society, on social life, but also on the environment. And they are this of since the 20th century, no doubt because of the fact that we have a kind of colonized imagination, uh, the West has provided the inspiration for how we build, whether it's in modernist styles or any other, whether it's postmodern, and there are many other kind of variations of that. But the Western model, which, remember, as I said, is itself that kind of architecture and building industry, is part of the problem of the sustainability crisis. That has been our ideal. And this involves very high embodied energy. Embodied energy is the energy that is consumed, say, by the time a brick is the earth is excavated, and it is fired, and it is brought to site. So the energy consumed at each stage of that journey, that aggregated, represents the embodied energy of a brick, right? So these are all the building as usual materials, whether reinforced cement concrete, which is basically cement, and stones, and steel. They're all very, very high. They have very high energy, embodied energy, which means they consume a lot of energy in being made themselves. And then so also elements like materials like glass, which are also very high in their embodied energy, but they also very often, when they are used like this without much thought, will end up also requiring more, adding to the heat loads and increasing the air conditioning loads on buildings, and therefore also creating consuming more energy in the operation of buildings. There's also, because buildings naturally sit on the landscape, they dig up and then they rearrange the surface and they remove trees and add new invasive species and so on. They damage the local landscape. And remember, even if you damage a patch, you have interrupted the continuity of various flows, whether of animals or insects or butterflies, doesn't matter what. You're interrupting biodiversity, the biosphere itself, disrupting it. It also disrupts remote landscapes, building as usual, any building, but especially building with industrial materials, because the cement that you're using comes out of some material excavated far away. And the more high-tech the material, the more complex its production, and the rarer it is, the greater the impact on remote landscapes, on the communities that are displaced. We know very well the bauxite issue, so much aluminum. Because we want aluminum, say aluminum finish in our buildings, we are basically throwing out communities from tribal communities from lands which are forested because there's bauxite inside. And it is also, there's an issue of serious labor exploitation across the world, especially, but also very much in India, and the degradation of humanity in the course of building our lovely buildings. Another dimension of building as usual is that when we choose to build in this way, we end up spending 60 or even more % of the total cost of the building goes to a small number of industrial product manufacturers, and much less, about 40%, goes to labor. And in a country like ours, it's where we have a wider labor pool which needs jobs and a decent living condition, that of course doesn't make a lot of sense. In operation also, these buildings will consume a lot of energy. As I said, they don't have wastewater treatment, so they dump all the waste directly, which goes, since our cities themselves barely treat 20% of the sewage, we are polluting various waterways, landscapes, and so on and so forth. And on top of it, these buildings are also not universally accessible. They are rarely designed to be barrier free, and so on. So many issues here with building as usual. High impact, and as I said, low awareness.